I still remember the exact moment my hands started shaking. It was a Tuesday afternoon in September, 2 years ago now, and I was standing in the lobby of a bank I'd never been to before, holding a piece of paper that would change everything I thought I knew about the past 20 years of my life. When I discovered what my ex-husband had been hiding all those years, my first reaction wasn't anger. It wasn't even shock. It was something closer to a laugh, the kind that bubbles up when the universe shows you just how spectacularly you've been played. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up, because this story doesn't start in that bank lobby. It starts much earlier, in a life that felt stable and predictable, right up until the moment it wasn't. My name is Dorothy Henderson, though most folks have called me Dot since I was knee-high to a grasshopper. I'm 64 years old now, and I'm sitting here in my little apartment in Springfield, Missouri, looking back on a life that took more twists and turns than Highway 65 on a foggy morning. This is my story, the real one, not the version I told myself for 2 decades to make sense of what happened. The truth has a funny way of hiding in plain sight, waiting for just the right moment to reveal itself. And when it does, well, it doesn't ask if you're ready. You know, there's something powerful about sharing real stories like this one. Before I dive in deeper, I want to ask you something. If this story resonates with you, if you believe in the power of women supporting each other through life's hardest moments, would you take just a second to hit that like button? These real stories need to reach other women who might be going through similar struggles, and your support helps make that happen. It's such a small action, but it means the world to this channel and to women everywhere who need to know they're not alone. Now, let me take you back to where this really began. I grew up in the 1960s and 70s in a part of Missouri where the Ozark Hills roll on forever, and everybody knows everybody else's business, or at least they think they do. Springfield wasn't the big city by any stretch, but it was bigger than the tiny farming community where I was born, a little speck on the map called Clever, about 20 minutes southwest. My daddy, James Robert Wilson, worked at the railroad yard, and my mama, Betty Ann, took in sewing and alterations to make ends meet. We lived in a modest house on North Grant Avenue, the kind with a screened-in porch that sagged a little on one side, and rooms that always smelled like whatever Mama was cooking, usually beans and cornbread, occasionally a pot roast on Sundays. I was the middle child of 5. My older brothers, Jimmy and Dale, were already working by the time I was in high school. Jimmy at the Kraft Foods plant and Dale doing construction. My younger sisters, Carol and Patricia, were still in elementary school when I graduated. Money was always tight in the Wilson household, the kind of tight where you wore hand-me-downs until they were more patch than original fabric, and a new pair of shoes was a Christmas and birthday present combined. But we were happy, or at least we had moments of happiness thread through the hard work. Daddy would come home with dirt under his fingernails and exhaustion in his eyes, but he'd still swing little Patricia up onto his shoulders and parade her around the backyard like she was the Queen of England. Mama's fingers were always busy with needle and thread, but she'd hum old gospel songs while she worked, and that humming made even the hardest days feel a little softer. I learned early what it meant to be a working-class woman in the American heartland. You made do. You stretched every dollar until it screamed. You didn't complain when things got hard because everyone else was going through the same struggles. And complaining wouldn't put food on the table or shoes on your children's feet. You found joy in small things, a good church potluck, a neighbor's kindness, the first warm day of spring after a brutal Missouri winter. School was my escape, though I didn't realize it at the time. I was good at English and history, the kind of subjects that didn't require expensive equipment or fancy materials. I'd lose myself in books from the Springfield Greene County Library, reading about places far from Missouri, lives far different from mine. My English teacher, Mrs. Thornton, once told me I had a gift for words, that I could maybe go to college if I worked hard enough. But college wasn't something families like mine thought much about in those days, especially not for daughters. College was for rich kids from the east side of Springfield, the ones whose daddies were lawyers or doctors, not railroad workers. I met Frank Henderson in the spring of 1981, just after I'd turned 22. He was 26, working as an assistant manager at the Sears store in the Battlefield Mall. I'd gone in to buy a birthday present for Mama, nothing fancy, just a nice set of dish towels, and Frank helped me find what I needed. He had dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way that made him look boyish, and he wore his work shirt tucked in neat and proper. He smiled easy, talked smooth, and made me feel like I was the only customer in the whole store. Looking back now with eyes that have seen too much, I can recognize the performance of it all. But back then, at 22, working at a diner as a waitress and living in a cramped apartment I shared with Carol, I didn't see the careful construction of his charm. I just saw a handsome man who paid attention to me, who asked me questions about my life and seemed genuinely interested in the answers. We started dating that summer. Frank would pick me up after my shift at the diner in his blue Ford pickup, not new, but well-maintained, which seemed like a sign of responsibility to my young eyes. We'd drive out to Fellows Lake or Table Rock, park somewhere with a view, and talk for hours. He told me about growing up in Joplin, about his daddy who died in a mining accident when Frank was 15, about his dreams of owning his own business someday. He painted pictures of a future that included me, a future with a nice house, maybe some kids, stability, and comfort. I wanted to believe in that future so badly. I'd spent my whole life watching my parents struggle, watching Mama's hands grow gnarled from constant sewing, watching Daddy's back bend a little more each year under the weight of hard labor. Frank represented something different, a way up, a way out of the cycle of just barely getting by. We got married in November of 1982, a small ceremony at the First Baptist Church on South Campbell. Mama made my dress, cream-colored cotton with lace she'd salvaged from an old tablecloth. We had the reception in the church basement with sandwiches and a sheet cake from Price Cutter. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours, and I remember feeling hopeful that day, like I was stepping into a better chapter of my life. The early years weren't bad, not exactly. We rented a small house in the Roundtree neighborhood, nothing special, but clean and affordable. Frank kept working at Sears, eventually becoming the full manager of the automotive department. I kept waitressing, adding my paychecks to his, building up a small savings account that we called our future fund. We talked about buying a house, about starting a family, about all the normal things young married couples discuss over dinner and during lazy Sunday mornings. Our daughter, Jennifer Lynn, was born in 1984. She came into this world screaming, red-faced and furious, and I loved her with an intensity that frightened me. Suddenly, everything mattered more, every dollar, every decision. Every step we took toward that future Frank had promised. Our son, Michael James, arrived 2 years later in 1986, quieter than his sister, but just as perfect. I'd look at them sleeping in their second-hand cribs and think that maybe, just maybe, we were building something real and lasting. I quit waitressing for a few years to stay home with the babies. Money got tighter, but Frank seemed to be doing well at Sears. He talked about bonuses and commissions, about opportunities for advancement. We managed, just barely, but we managed. I clipped coupons religiously, shopped sales, made meals that could stretch across multiple days. It was the life I'd known growing up, just with my own family now, and I accepted it as normal, as the way things were supposed to be. But there were moments, small ones that I dismissed at the time, when something felt off. Frank would come home later than his shift should have ended, smelling like cigarettes though he didn't smoke, or at least not that I knew of. He'd get defensive when I asked about his day, snapping at me in ways that seemed disproportionate to the question. He started keeping his wallet in his locked glove compartment, said it was safer there than in the house. He'd receive phone calls and take them outside, walking into the backyard or sitting in his truck, speaking in low tones I couldn't make out through the windows. I rationalized every single thing. He was working hard, stressed about providing for us. He was tired, overworked, entitled to his privacy. I was being paranoid, nosy, ungrateful for the roof over our heads and the food on our table. That's what women did in those days, or at least what women like me did. We swallowed our doubts, pushed down our intuition, and kept the household running smoothly. The years rolled on. Jennifer started school in 1989, Michael in 1991. I went back to work part-time when Michael entered kindergarten, taking a job at the front desk of a dental office on South Fremont. The hours were better than waitressing, the pay slightly higher, and I could usually be home when the kids got off the school bus. Frank seemed to be doing even better at Sears. We finally bought a house in 1992, a modest 3-bedroom ranch on the west side of town. It needed work, but it was ours, and I threw myself into making it a home, painting rooms in cheerful colors and planting a small garden in the backyard. On the surface, we looked like any other working-class family in Springfield. We went to church on Sundays, or at least I did, taking the kids while Frank often claimed he needed to catch up on work. We attended school functions and Little League games. We had barbecues with neighbors and took the occasional weekend trip to Branson to see a show. We were building a life, or so I believed. But underneath that surface, cracks were forming. Frank became more distant, more secretive. He opened a separate checking account, said it was for his business expenses, though he never quite explained what business he meant. He'd disappear on Saturday afternoons, claiming he was playing poker with guys from work, but he'd come back hours later with no winnings or losses to show for it. When I pressed him, his explanations were vague and his irritation evident. I told myself I was lucky. I had healthy kids, a house, a husband with a steady job. So many women had it worse. What right did I have to complain about a husband who kept to himself a little more than he used to? What right did I have to question the man who was providing for our family? That's the insidious thing about slow erosion. You don't notice the ground disappearing beneath your feet until you're already falling. By the time the year 2000 rolled around, I'd been married to Frank Henderson for 18 years. Jennifer was 16, a junior at Central High School. Smart as a whip and already talking about college, something I encouraged even though I had no idea how we'd afford it. Michael was 14, quieter than his sister, but steady. The kind of kid who could spend hours tinkering with broken electronics in the garage, taking them apart and putting them back together just to understand how they worked. I'd settled into a routine that felt as comfortable as an old pair of slippers, even if those slippers were a bit worn and didn't fit quite right anymore. I worked 40 hours a week at the dental office. Dr. Patterson was a kind man who paid fairly and never made me feel lesser for my lack of formal education. I managed the household, cooked the meals, did the laundry, paid the bills from the joint account that Frank and I shared, though he kept that other account separate, the one he said was for his personal business dealings. Frank, by then, had been with Sears for nearly 20 years. He'd worked his way up to a regional position that had him traveling occasionally, Kansas City, St. Louis, sometimes as far as Oklahoma City or Little Rock. The travel seemed legitimate enough. He'd show me his schedule, the hotels where he'd be staying. He'd call from the road, brief conversations about nothing much, just checking in. I accepted it all without question, because that's what I'd trained myself to do over the years. Accept, adapt, keep moving forward. Our life looked stable from the outside. We'd paid down enough of the mortgage that we had some equity in the house. The kids were healthy and doing well in school. We took a vacation to Gulf Shores, Alabama in the summer of 1999, our first real vacation in years, and spent a week building sandcastles with Michael and watching Jennifer tan on the beach while reading paperback novels. We had dinner at Red Lobster and stayed in a modest motel where you could hear the ocean through the thin walls. It wasn't luxurious, but it felt like we'd made it to some version of the American dream. But that dream was built on sand, and the tide was coming in. The first real sign, the one I couldn't explain away, came in January of 2000. I was organizing the filing cabinet in our home office, a small converted bedroom where we kept all our important papers. I'd been putting off the task for months, but with the new year, I'd decided to get everything in order for tax season. I was sorting through old receipts and bank statements when I found a credit card statement that didn't look familiar. It was addressed to Frank, but sent to a P.O. box I didn't know we had. The balance was substantial, nearly $8,000. The charges were for things that made no sense to me: cash advances, mostly, payments to companies with names I didn't recognize, a few charges from restaurants in cities Frank had supposedly been visiting for work, but dated on days when he'd told me he was coming straight home. I felt my stomach drop. I sat there on the floor of that little office, surrounded by stacks of paper, and felt the first real tremor of fear run through me. I wanted to dismiss it, to find some reasonable explanation, but the numbers didn't lie. $8,000 in debt I knew nothing about. When Frank came home that evening, I was waiting at the kitchen table with the statement in front of me. I'd rehearsed what I wanted to say, trying to keep my voice calm and non-accusatory. I decided to give him the benefit of the doubt, to assume there was some explanation I hadn't considered. He walked in, saw me sitting there with the paper, and his face went through a series of expressions I'd never seen before: surprise, anger, calculation. He grabbed the statement from the table, his hands rough in a way that startled me. His explanation came fast, words tumbling over each other. The account was for business expenses that Sears would reimburse. He'd needed the separate P.O. box for work-related mail. He hadn't told me because he didn't want to worry me with the details. The cash advances were for supplier payments that had to be made in cash. It was complicated, he said, too complicated to explain right then when he was exhausted from a long day. I wanted to believe him. God, how I wanted to believe him. So I nodded, accepted his words even though they didn't quite make sense, and let him put the statement away in his locked filing drawer. A drawer I'd never had a key to, never thought to ask for a key to. But that night, lying in bed while Frank snored beside me, I couldn't sleep. Something had shifted. A door had opened in my mind, and I couldn't close it, no matter how hard I tried. The second sign came in March, about 2 months later. Frank's sister, Margaret, called the house on a Saturday afternoon when Frank was supposedly out running errands. She lived in Tulsa, and we only spoke a few times a year. Usually around holidays, she sounded upset on the phone, asking if Frank was okay, if everything was all right with us. I assured her everything was fine, confused by her concern. She hesitated, then told me that their mother, Frank's mother, Eleanor, had tried to call our house several times in the past few weeks, but kept getting a message that the number was disconnected. She'd called Margaret in a panic, worried that something had happened to us. I felt ice form in my veins. Our number wasn't disconnected. It couldn't be. I was talking to Margaret on that very phone. I asked her what number Eleanor had been trying. Margaret gave me a number I didn't recognize, said it was the one Frank had given their mother at Christmas, told her it was our new number after we'd switched phone companies for a better rate. After I hung up with Margaret, I sat in the quiet kitchen and tried to make sense of it. Why would Frank give his mother a fake phone number? Why would he lie about something so strange and specific? I called the number Margaret had given me, my hands shaking as I dialed. It rang and rang, no answer, no voicemail, just endless ringing that made my chest feel tight. When Frank came home, I confronted him again. This time, his anger was immediate and intense. He accused me of calling his family and embarrassing him. He said I'd misunderstood, that I'd gotten the numbers mixed up, that his mother was getting old and confused. He turned it around on me so quickly that I found myself apologizing, saying I was sorry for causing trouble, for bothering his sister, for questioning him. But later, alone in the bathroom with the door locked, I let myself cry for the first time in years, deep, quiet sobs that I muffled with a towel so the kids wouldn't hear. Because somewhere in my gut, in that place where women's intuition lives, I knew. I knew something was very wrong, even if I couldn't name it yet, even if I wasn't ready to face it. The third sign was in May. Jennifer was getting ready for prom, and we'd gone shopping for a dress together at the mall. We'd found a beautiful lavender gown on sale, and I told her we could afford it, that she deserved to feel special on her prom night. I'd written a check from our joint account, feeling proud that we could give our daughter this moment. 2 days later, the check bounced. The dress shop called the house, polite but firm, saying the check had been returned for insufficient funds, and they'd need payment immediately or they'd have to take the dress back. I was mortified, confused. I checked the balance just that morning, and there should have been more than enough to cover the dress and then some. I went to the bank that afternoon, demanded to see the account activity. The teller, a young woman who looked uncomfortable delivering the news, showed me the statements. Over the past month, there had been multiple large withdrawals that I hadn't made: cashier's check, wire transfers, ATM withdrawals from cities I'd never been to. Our account had been systematically drained, and I'd had no idea. I paid for Jennifer's dress in cash that I'd been saving in a coffee can in the back of the pantry, my secret emergency fund. Money I'd squirreled away dollar by dollar from grocery savings and the occasional tip from patients at the dental office who were especially grateful for my help. It was supposed to be for real emergencies, but this qualified. Jennifer couldn't know her dress had bounced, couldn't know that something was deeply wrong. That night, I waited until the kids were in bed before I showed Frank the bank statements. I didn't yell, I didn't cry. I just laid the papers in front of him and asked him, quietly, what was happening? Where was our money going? Why was he draining our account without telling me? His explanation was different this time. Business opportunity, he said. Investment that was going to pay off big, set us up for life. He'd wanted to surprise me, didn't want to get my hopes up in case it didn't work out. The money was temporarily gone, but it would come back, doubled, tripled. I just needed to trust him, be patient, stop questioning every little thing he did. I wanted to believe him. I wanted it so badly that I almost convinced myself. But that night, lying awake again while he slept peacefully beside me, I started making mental lists of all the small, strange things I'd noticed over the years. The late nights, the separate accounts, the fake phone numbers, the mysterious debt, the drained savings. Individually, each thing might have had an innocent explanation. Together, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. The fourth sign came in July, during a heat wave that made the whole house feel like an oven, despite the window air conditioning units running constantly. Frank had been gone more than usual, those business trips he'd mentioned, getting longer and more frequent. He'd be gone for days at a time, checking in less and less, his explanations vague and hurried when I asked for details. One afternoon, while doing laundry, I found a receipt in the pocket of one of Frank's shirts. It was from a restaurant in Branson, the Candlestick Inn, a place I knew was romantic and expensive because I'd seen it featured in a Springfield Newsleader article about anniversary destinations. The receipt was dated from the previous weekend, a Saturday night when Frank had told me he was in Kansas City for a work conference. The receipt was for 2 dinners, 2 bottles of wine, dessert. The total was more than I spent on groceries for a week. But it wasn't the money that made my hands shake as I held that small piece of paper. It was the fact that he'd lied about where he was, who he was with. It was the realization that was forming, slow and terrible, that my husband had another life I knew nothing about. I didn't confront him that time. Instead, I did something I'd never done before. I started paying attention, really paying attention. I noted when he left and when he returned. I checked the mileage on his truck against where he said he'd been. I started going through his pockets before doing laundry, though it made me feel like a spy in my own home, like I was the one doing something wrong. What I found terrified me. More receipts from restaurants in cities he supposedly wasn't visiting. ATM withdrawals from locations he'd never mentioned. A matchbook from a hotel in Little Rock with a phone number written on the inside cover. Each discovery was like a small cut, and they were adding up, bleeding me dry of the trust I'd built my entire adult life upon. The fifth sign came in September, just as the leaves were starting to turn and the air held that first hint of fall coolness. Frank had been especially distant, barely home even when he wasn't traveling. When he was home, he'd spend hours locked in the home office, talking in low voices on the phone, snapping at anyone who interrupted him. One evening, the phone rang while Frank was in the shower. I answered to hear a woman's voice, pleasant and professional, asking for Frank Henderson. I said he wasn't available and asked if I could take a message. She said she was calling from American Express about his account application, needed to verify some information. I told her she must have the wrong number, that we didn't have an American Express card. She apologized, said she must have made a mistake, and hung up quickly. But before she did, I heard her say something that made my blood run cold. She said, "Oh, I'm so sorry, Mrs. Henderson. I must have the wrong Frank Henderson." Mrs. Henderson. She'd called me Mrs. Henderson. How did she know my name if she'd called the wrong number? When Frank got out of the shower, I asked him about it casually, trying to keep my voice light. He barely looked up from his newspaper, said it was probably a scam call. Identity theft was getting so common these days, I shouldn't worry about it. But I saw his jaw tighten, saw the way his hands gripped the paper a little tighter. That night, I did something I never thought I'd do. I waited until Frank was asleep, then I carefully, quietly went through his wallet. I'd never done that before, not in 18 years of marriage. It felt like such a violation, but I had to know. I had to understand what was happening to my life. Inside, I found the usual things: his driver's license, some cash, a few credit cards I recognized. But tucked behind his Sears employee ID, I found another card. It was a membership card for a gym in Joplin, his hometown, hours away from Springfield. Why would he have a gym membership in Joplin when we lived in Springfield? The card had been recently validated, the magnetic strip shiny and new. I put everything back exactly as I'd found it, my hands trembling so badly I could barely slide the wallet back into his pants pocket. I went to the bathroom and sat on the closed toilet lid, trying to breathe, trying to think, trying to make sense of the impossible thought that was forming in my mind. What if Frank had another life? What if everything he'd been telling me for years was a lie? The sixth sign came in early November, just before Thanksgiving. I'd noticed our mail had been lighter than usual, fewer bills arriving, fewer statements. I'd mentioned it to Frank casually, and he'd said he'd switched us to paperless billing for everything, easier to keep track of that way, better for the environment. But one Saturday afternoon, when Frank claimed he was playing poker with friends from work, I decided to drive to the post office. I told the kids I needed to mail a package, a lie, one of the first I'd ever told them, and instead I went to ask if we had a P.O. box I didn't know about. The clerk, an older woman who'd been working there for years, checked their records. Yes, she said, Frank Henderson had rented a box 6 months ago. Box 847. Did I want to access it? I said, no thank you, I just wanted to confirm. I left before she could ask any more questions, before the tears that were building could fall. 6 months. He'd been diverting our mail for 6 months, and I'd been too trusting, too busy, too willfully blind to notice. The seventh sign was in December, right before Christmas. I'd been saving what little money I could to buy presents for the kids, hiding cash in that coffee can again, rebuilding the emergency fund I'd had to spend on Jennifer's prom dress. I'd managed to save about $200, not much, but enough to get each kid something special. One morning, I went to get the cash to go Christmas shopping, and the can was lighter than it should have been. I opened it, counted. Half the money was gone. I knew immediately what had happened. Frank had found my hiding spot, had taken what I'd worked so hard to save. I confronted him that evening, and for the first time, he didn't bother making excuses. He just looked at me with cold eyes and said it was his money too, that I didn't have the right to hide money from him, that everything we had belonged to both of us. The way he said it, though, made it clear he meant everything belonged to him. I spent that Christmas in a haze, going through the motions of decorating and cooking and pretending everything was fine. Jennifer and Michael were old enough to sense something was wrong, but young enough that they didn't ask direct questions, for which I was grateful. I didn't have answers I could give them. I barely had answers I could give myself. The eighth and final sign, the one that should have prepared me but didn't, came in late January of 2001. Frank had been gone for a week on what he said was an important business trip to Dallas. He was supposed to return on a Friday evening. Friday came and went. Saturday morning arrived with no word from him. I called his cell phone. He'd finally gotten one the year before, and it went straight to voicemail. By Saturday afternoon, I was frantic. I called Sears, asked to speak to his supervisor, a man named Gary I'd met a few times at company picnics. Gary sounded confused. He said Frank had requested the week off for personal reasons, wasn't on any business trip that he knew of. In fact, Gary said, Frank had been taking a lot of personal time lately, was using up all his vacation days and then some. I hung up the phone feeling like I might vomit. I told Jennifer and Michael that Dad had gotten delayed, would be home soon, not to worry. But I was worried. I was terrified, because in that moment I realized I had no idea where my husband actually was, what he was actually doing, who he actually was. He came home Sunday night, offering no explanation beyond car trouble and a dead cell phone battery. His clothes smelled like laundry detergent I didn't use, floral and sweet. He had a tan that didn't come from winter in Missouri or Dallas, and when I asked him directly where he'd been, what he'd been doing, he looked at me with such contempt that I physically stepped back. He told me to stop being paranoid, stop being pathetic, stop questioning him like he was a criminal. He said he worked hard to provide for this family, and all I did was nag and complain. He said maybe he needed to get away from me sometimes. Did I ever think about that? That living with someone who was constantly suspicious and ungrateful was exhausting? He turned my fear into my fault. He made me question my own sanity, my own right to ask basic questions about my own life, my own marriage. That night, I lay in bed beside a man I'd been married to for 18 years and realized I didn't know him at all. Worse, I realized that the life I thought we'd built together might be nothing but smoke and mirrors, and I had no idea what was real anymore. I should have left then. I should have taken the kids and walked away, started over, protected what little we had left, but I didn't. Because I was 42 years old with 2 teenagers, a part-time job at a dental office, and no real savings left. Because I'd spent my entire adult life being Mrs. Frank Henderson, and I didn't know how to be just Dorothy Wilson again. Because I was scared and ashamed, and still hoping that somehow this was all a misunderstanding that would resolve itself if I just held on a little longer. I didn't know that in just a few weeks, the decision would be taken out of my hands entirely. I didn't know that the life I'd been clinging to was already gone, burned to ashes while I'd been busy pretending I couldn't smell the smoke. The breaking point came on a Tuesday in February of 2001. It was one of those gray Missouri winter days where the sky hangs low and heavy, promising snow that never quite arrives. I'd taken the afternoon off from work because I hadn't been sleeping, hadn't been eating right, and Dr. Patterson had noticed. He'd pulled me aside that morning, his kind face creased with concern, and told me I looked like death warmed over, that I needed to go home and rest. But I couldn't rest. My mind was spinning with all those signs, all those little pieces of evidence I'd been collecting like poisonous breadcrumbs. I'd started keeping a notebook hidden in the bottom of my underwear drawer, writing down dates and details I was afraid I'd forget or talk myself out of believing. The restaurant receipts, the fake phone number, the drained bank account, the mysterious credit card, the lies about work trips, the gym membership in Joplin, the secret P.O. box, the missing cash from my coffee can, the week he'd disappeared to Dallas that wasn't Dallas. Sitting in our quiet house that afternoon, with Jennifer at school and Michael at basketball practice, I made a decision. I was going to look for proof, real, concrete proof that I wasn't losing my mind, that my suspicions were justified, that the man I'd married had become someone I didn't know. I started with the home office. Frank had always kept it locked when he wasn't in there, said he needed privacy for his work documents and didn't want the kids messing with his files. I'd accepted that explanation for years, respecting his space the way I'd been taught to respect a man's domain. But that day, I didn't care about respect or boundaries or what I was supposed to do. I found a letter opener in the kitchen drawer and went to work on the office door lock. It wasn't sophisticated, just a simple push-button lock that took me about 10 minutes to jimmy open. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the letter opener steady, but eventually I heard the click and the door swung open. The office was neat, almost obsessively so. Frank's desk was organized with precision, pens in a cup, papers in labeled folders, his computer sitting in the center with the monitor dark. I sat down in his chair, and that's when I noticed the locked filing cabinet beside the desk. I'd seen it 1,000 times, but had never tried to open it, had never had a key, had never been offered one. I tried the same letter opener technique, but the cabinet lock was sturdier. I was about to give up when I remembered something. Frank had a small toolbox he kept in the garage for basic repairs. I ran out and grabbed it, found a flathead screwdriver, and went back to work on that filing cabinet like my life depended on it, because in a way, it did. When the lock finally gave way and the drawer slid open, I sat back and stared at the contents. There were files, dozens of them, meticulously labeled and organized. I pulled out the first one with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. Bank statements, not from our joint account, but from accounts I'd never seen before. Checking accounts, savings accounts, investment accounts, all in Frank's name alone. The balances made my stomach turn. Tens of thousands of dollars, money I knew nothing about, money that had been hidden from me while I'd clipped coupons and reused aluminum foil and worried about affording Jennifer's college applications. I pulled out another file, credit card statements. Not the one I'd found that day in January of 2000, but others. 5 different cards, all with balances ranging from $5,000 to $15,000. The charges were for things I couldn't begin to comprehend. Designer clothes from stores I'd never been to, hotel rooms in cities all across the Midwest, jewelry purchases from stores in Joplin and Tulsa and Little Rock, flowers sent to addresses I didn't recognize, gifts, dinners, plane tickets. A life of spending that existed parallel to the one where I worried about the electric bill. But it was the third file that broke something inside me. It was labeled Property in Frank's neat handwriting. Inside were documents for a condominium in Joplin. A 2-bedroom unit in a nice complex near the university. Purchase date 1997. 4 years. He'd owned a separate property for 4 years, and I'd known nothing about it. The mortgage statements were there, showing regular payments from one of those hidden bank accounts. Utility bills showing constant usage, not a vacant property, but one that was lived in. And tucked in the back, almost like he'd forgotten it was there, was a photograph. It was Frank, smiling broadly, his arm around a woman I'd never seen before. She was younger than me, maybe in her early 30s, blonde and pretty in a way that made my middle-aged insecurities flare up like a fresh wound. They were standing in front of what looked like a fireplace, both of them casual and comfortable, like they belonged together. I dropped the photo like it had burned me. My breathing came fast and shallow, my vision narrowing to a pinpoint. This was it. This was the proof I'd been looking for and dreading in equal measure. My husband had another life, another home, another woman, probably another identity altogether, where he wasn't the struggling regional manager barely making ends meet, but someone with money and freedom and a completely separate existence. I don't know how long I sat there on the floor of that office, surrounded by evidence of betrayal so massive I couldn't fully comprehend it. It might have been minutes, might have been an hour. Time lost all meaning as my brain tried to process what my eyes were seeing, what my hands were holding, what my heart was breaking over. Eventually, I heard the front door open. Michael was home from practice. I shoved everything back into the filing cabinet, closed the drawer, tried to make the lock look less obviously broken. I stumbled out of the office and somehow managed to act normal enough that Michael didn't notice anything was wrong. I made him a snack, asked about practice, moved through the motions while my mind screamed. When Frank came home that evening, I was in the kitchen making dinner, spaghetti, his favorite, because some part of me was still operating on autopilot, still playing the role of dutiful wife, even as my world imploded. He walked in, kissed the top of my head absently, asked what was for dinner. So casual, so normal, like he hadn't been living a double life for years, like he hadn't been stealing from our family to fund his secret existence. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the pot of boiling pasta at him. I wanted to demand answers, to force him to look me in the eye and explain how he could do this. But I didn't. Because standing there in my kitchen, wooden spoon in hand, I realized something crucial. If I confronted him now, with the kids home, with no plan, with no protection for myself, I'd lose whatever small advantage I had. So I served dinner. I sat across from him at our kitchen table. I watched him eat the food I'd prepared while he made small talk about his day, while Jennifer complained about her physics homework, while Michael talked about the upcoming basketball tournament. I watched this man, who was my husband and a stranger, and I began to plan. Over the next few days, I went back to that filing cabinet when I knew Frank would be gone for hours. I didn't just look this time, I documented. I used the copy machine at Dr. Patterson's office during my lunch breaks to make copies of everything. Bank statements, credit card bills, the property deed for the Joplin condo, utility bills, phone records I found that showed calls to numbers I didn't know. I created my own file, my own evidence, and I hid it at work in a locked drawer that only I had the key to. I also found something else in one of those late-night searches through Frank's papers, a second cell phone bill, not for the phone I knew he carried, but for another number entirely. I recognized some of the numbers he'd called, his mother Eleanor's number in Tulsa, his sister Margaret's number, the main line at Sears. But there were other numbers, called frequently and for long durations. One number in particular appeared almost daily, sometimes multiple times a day. I waited until Frank was on one of his trips, Kansas City, he said, though I no longer believed a word that came out of his mouth, and I called that number from a payphone outside the Price Cutter grocery store. A woman answered on the third ring, her voice soft and pleasant. "Hello?" she said. My throat closed up. I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. "Hello? Frank, is that you?" she asked. I hung up, stood there shaking in the cold February air while shoppers pushed their carts past me, going about their normal lives while mine fell apart. She'd expected it to be Frank. She'd said his name with familiarity, with intimacy. This wasn't a work colleague or a distant friend. This was someone who knew him, expected his calls, waited for them. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house creak and settle around me. And I faced a terrible truth. My marriage was over. It had probably been over for years, but I'd been too afraid or too stubborn or too hopeful to see it. Frank had built an entirely separate life, and I was just the woman in Springfield who cooked his occasional dinners and laundered his shirts, and had given him 2 children he barely seemed to notice anymore. The question wasn't whether to leave. The question was how to survive what was coming. I started making quiet preparations. I opened my own bank account at a different bank, one Frank didn't use, and I had my paychecks from the dental office deposited there. It wasn't much, I only worked part-time, but it was mine and mine alone. I gathered all our important documents that I could find: birth certificates for me and the kids, social security cards, insurance papers, the deed to our house. I made copies and hid the originals at work. I talked to Carol, my sister, late one night when I knew Frank was asleep. I told her everything, the words tumbling out in harsh whispers. She was shocked, angry, protective. She told me I could stay with her if I needed to, that she'd help me however she could. Just knowing I had that option made me feel less trapped, less alone. I also did something I never thought I'd do. I consulted with a lawyer. Not to file for divorce yet, but just to understand my options, my rights. I found a woman attorney in town, Linda Morrison, who specialized in family law. I paid for the consultation in cash from my secret account, afraid to leave any paper trail Frank might discover. Linda was direct and practical. She told me that Missouri was an equitable distribution state, that marital assets would be divided fairly, though not necessarily equally, in a divorce. She said the hidden accounts would work in my favor, that the court wouldn't look kindly on a husband who'd been deceiving his wife financially. She advised me to document everything, which I'd already started doing. She said when I was ready to file, she'd help me. She also warned me that divorce could get ugly, especially when there was money hidden and infidelity involved. I left her office feeling both empowered and terrified. This was real. This was happening. My marriage was ending, and I was going to have to fight for whatever scraps of stability I could salvage. But I wasn't ready yet. I needed more time to prepare, to save more money, to get the kids through the school year before turning their world upside down. Jennifer was applying to colleges, and I didn't want this to derail her future. Michael was thriving in basketball, and he needed that stability. I told myself I could hold on a little longer, could play this part a little while more. That was my mistake, because Frank was making his own plans, and his timeline didn't include waiting for me to be ready. It happened on a Thursday in early March. I came home from work to find the house strangely quiet. Jennifer's car wasn't in the driveway, though it should have been. She was supposed to be home studying for her SATs. Michael's bike was in the garage, but he wasn't answering when I called his name. I found the note on the kitchen table, propped up against the salt and pepper shakers. White paper, Frank's handwriting, 2 paragraphs that destroyed everything. Dorothy, by the time you read this, I'll be gone. I've taken what's mine and left the rest. The house is in both our names, so you can keep it, but you'll have to figure out the mortgage on your own. I've closed our joint accounts and taken my name off all shared credit. I'm done with this life, done pretending to be someone I'm not. Don't try to find me. Don't call my family. I've already explained to them that we're separating due to irreconcilable differences. And they understand. The kids know I love them, but they're old enough to be fine without me around. You've always been better at the parenting stuff anyway. Good luck. I read it once, twice, 3 times. The words didn't change. He was gone, just like that. 18 years of marriage, 2 children, a life built together, and he'd reduced it to 2 paragraphs in a signature. My hands started shaking so badly the paper rattled. I set it down carefully, like it might explode. And that's when I saw the second envelope underneath it. My name was written on the front in Jennifer's handwriting. I opened it with numb fingers. Mom. Dad came to the school today and pulled me out of class. He said he was leaving, that he and you were getting divorced, that he needed to start a new life. He was crying, Mom. I've never seen him cry before. He said he was sorry, but he couldn't stay in a marriage that made him unhappy. He gave me $500 in cash and said to use it for whatever I needed. Then he left. I didn't know what to do. I came home and Michael was here. Dad had already talked to him too. Michael's in his room and won't come out. Mom, what's happening? Why is Dad leaving? Is this really about you two being unhappy, or is there something else? I'm at Sarah's house. I couldn't stay there alone with Michael so upset. Call me when you get this. Love, Jen. I stood in my kitchen holding those 2 pieces of paper, and I felt something inside me shift. The fear, the grief, the shame, it all transformed into something harder, colder, rage, pure, crystallized rage. He'd done it. He'd actually done it. He'd left me at 42 years old with 2 teenagers, a mortgage I couldn't afford on my part-time salary, and apparently no access to any of our money. He'd gone to our children's schools, disrupted their days, told them lies about our marriage to make himself look like the victim. He'd abandoned his family without warning, without discussion, without giving me any chance to prepare or protect our kids from the fallout. And he'd done it knowing I'd struggle, knowing I'd have to figure out how to survive with no savings, no financial safety net, nothing but a part-time job and a house I couldn't afford to keep. I went to check the mailbox, found a stack of envelopes I hadn't gotten around to opening from the past few days. Bills, mostly. I opened them with shaking hands. The electric company, the water department, the mortgage company, the credit card we'd used for emergencies. Every single one had a notice. Frank Henderson had removed his name from the account. I was solely responsible for all debts. All payments were now due from me and me alone. I called the bank where we'd had our joint account. The pleasant woman who answered told me what I already knew. Mr. Henderson had closed the account 2 days ago. Yes, he'd withdrawn all the funds. No, there was nothing they could do. It had been a joint account, and he had every right to close it. I asked about the mortgage account, the automatic payments we'd set up years ago. She checked and confirmed my worst fear. The automatic payment had been canceled. If I didn't make the March payment manually by the end of the month, I'd be in default. I hung up and immediately called the number on the mortgage statement. A patient man walked me through the numbers I needed to hear. My mortgage payment was $847 a month. My take-home pay from the dental office was roughly $1,100 a month. That left me $253 for everything else: food, utilities, gas, insurance, everything Jennifer and Michael needed. It was impossible, completely impossible. I went upstairs and knocked on Michael's door. He didn't answer, but I could hear him crying inside, the sound muffled like he was trying to hide it. I opened the door slowly. He was on his bed, face buried in his pillow. His 14-year-old body shaking with sobs he couldn't control. I sat on the edge of his bed and put my hand on his back. He turned and threw his arms around me, crying like he had when he was little and had nightmares. I held my son and let him cry, and I didn't cry myself because I couldn't afford to fall apart. Not yet. Not when my children needed me to be strong. "Why did he leave, Mom?" Michael asked through his tears. "Did we do something wrong? Was it my fault?" "No, baby," I told him, stroking his hair. "No, this is not your fault, not even a little bit. Your dad has made choices that have nothing to do with you or your sister. This is about him, not about us." But he said you two were unhappy. He said it wasn't working anymore. I took a deep breath, chose my words carefully. Sometimes people aren't who we think they are. Sometimes people make choices that hurt the people who love them. But I need you to know something, Michael. I'm not going anywhere. You and Jennifer, you're my whole world. We're going to figure this out together, okay? He nodded against my shoulder, and I held him until his crying slowed and then stopped. Eventually, he fell asleep, exhausted from emotion, and I covered him with a blanket before heading back downstairs. I called Jennifer at her friend's house and told her to come home. When she arrived, I sat both kids down in the living room and told them the truth, as much of it as they needed to know right then. Their father had left. We were getting divorced. Money was going to be very tight for a while. Things were going to change. Jennifer, almost 17 and far too mature for her age, asked the practical questions. Could she still go to college? Could Michael keep playing basketball? Were we going to lose the house? I answered honestly, I didn't know yet. I was going to do everything I could to keep things as normal as possible, but I needed their help and their patience. We were a team now. The three of us, and we'd figure it out together. That night, after the kids had gone to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of bills, and I tried to make numbers work that couldn't possibly work. I had exactly $438 in my new bank account, my last 2 paychecks. Frank had cleaned out everything else. The mortgage was due in 3 weeks. The utilities were due before that. The kids needed food, needed supplies, needed gas money for Jennifer's car. I worked the numbers a dozen different ways, but the math was brutal and unforgiving. I couldn't do it alone. I couldn't keep the house, couldn't maintain even a basic standard of living, couldn't give my children the stability they deserved, not on what I was making. At some point during that long, dark night, I must have fallen asleep at the table because I woke up to pale dawn light coming through the windows and Jennifer standing beside me with a cup of coffee. "Mom," she said gently, "you need to sleep in a real bed." I took the coffee, grateful for its warmth. "I'm okay, honey." "No, you're not," she said, and her voice was strong, not accusatory, but certain. "And that's okay. You don't have to be okay right now. But Mom, we need a plan. We need to figure out what we're going to do." She was right. Sitting there feeling sorry for myself, trying to make impossible numbers work, wasn't going to save us. I needed to act, needed to fight, needed to become someone stronger than the woman who'd spent 18 years accepting whatever Frank told her without question. So I made a list. Not of bills this time, but of actions. Things I needed to do to survive this, to protect my children, to build something new from the ruins of my broken marriage. 1. Call Linda Morrison, the lawyer, and file for divorce immediately. Sue Frank for abandonment, for child support, for his share of the marital assets he'd hidden. 2. Find a full-time job. Something that paid enough to cover the mortgage and bills. I'd have to leave the dental office, leave Dr. Patterson, who'd been so kind, but I had no choice. 3. Apply for any assistance I qualified for. Food stamps, utility assistance, anything that could help bridge the gap while I got on my feet. 4. Sit down with the kids and create a real budget. Explain what we could and couldn't afford. Make them part of the solution instead of shielding them from the reality we faced. 5. Contact Frank's family, tell them my side of the story before he poisoned them completely against me. They deserve to know the truth about who their son and brother really was. The list grew as the sun rose higher, and with each item I wrote down, I felt a little less helpless, a little more in control. I couldn't control what Frank had done. I couldn't control the fact that he'd abandoned us without warning or remorse. But I could control what came next. I could fight for my children and for myself. At 42 years old, with my marriage in ashes and my future uncertain, I made a choice. I wasn't going to let Frank Henderson destroy me. I wasn't going to let this betrayal define the rest of my life. I was going to survive this. And somehow, someday, I was going to make sure he understood exactly what he'd thrown away when he walked out that door. The first few months after Frank left were the hardest I'd ever lived through. March bled into April, April into May, and every day felt like trying to run uphill through mud with weights tied to my ankles. But I kept moving forward because stopping meant giving up, and I had 2 children depending on me to figure this out. Linda Morrison, my lawyer, filed for divorce immediately. She also filed for emergency child support and requested a full discovery of Frank's financial assets. The problem was, Frank had disappeared. Completely. His cell phone was disconnected. His work number at Sears went to his former supervisor, Gary, who told us Frank had resigned, effective immediately, with no forwarding address. His mother, Eleanor, claimed she didn't know where he was, and I actually believed her. She sounded genuinely confused and hurt when I spoke to her. Without Frank's location, the court couldn't serve him papers. Without serving him, we couldn't proceed with the divorce or force him to pay child support. We were stuck in legal limbo while the bills kept coming. I did find full-time work, though it broke my heart to leave Dr. Patterson. He understood, even hugged me, and told me I'd always have a reference from him if I needed it. My new job was as a receptionist at a manufacturing company on the north side of Springfield, Precision Parts and Equipment. The hours were longer, 8 to 5 with a half-hour lunch, and the work was boring as dishwater, but it paid $28,000 a year with benefits. It was enough to cover the mortgage with a little left over, barely, if we were extremely careful about everything else. Jennifer got a part-time job working retail at the mall. She was supposed to be focusing on her senior year, on her college applications and SATs, but instead she was working 20 hours a week to help pay for groceries and her own expenses. I hated that she had to do that, hated that Frank's abandonment had stolen her last year of childhood, but I was also proud of her strength and resilience. Michael quit basketball. He said it was his choice, that he didn't enjoy it anymore anyway, but I knew the truth. We couldn't afford the fees and the travel to away games, and he didn't want to ask me for money we didn't have. I watched my 14-year-old son sacrifice something he loved, and I added it to the growing list of things I needed Frank to answer for someday. We applied for food assistance and got approved for $300 a month in food stamps. It helped, but it was humiliating walking into the grocery store and paying with that EBT card, seeing the looks from people I'd known for years, feeling their judgment and pity. Springfield wasn't that big of a town. People talked. Everyone knew that Frank Henderson had left his wife and kids with nothing. The house became harder to maintain. Things broke, and I couldn't afford to fix them. The air conditioning went out in June, a disaster in a Missouri summer, and we survived with box fans from Walmart and cool baths before bed. The dishwasher stopped working in July, so we washed everything by hand. The lawn grew wild because I couldn't afford gas for the mower and didn't have time to push the manual one Carol lent me. Our neighbors, the Richardsons, started making comments about how the house was bringing down property values. Mrs. Richardson actually had the nerve to suggest I might want to consider moving somewhere more appropriate to my circumstances. I smiled politely and went inside and cried angry tears in my bedroom where the kids wouldn't see. But there were moments of grace, too. People from church, we'd been attending First Baptist for years, quietly helped without making a fuss about it. Someone left bags of groceries on our porch. Anonymous cards would appear in the mail with $20 or $50 inside and notes saying, "Praying for you." The school counselor at Central High made sure Jennifer knew about every scholarship opportunity available. Carol was a lifeline. She'd come over on weekends with her husband Tom, and they'd help with things around the house we couldn't manage alone. Tom fixed the bathroom sink, patched holes in the drywall, got the lawnmower running again. Carol would sit with me and help me go over bills, find ways to cut costs, remind me I wasn't alone when the weight of it all felt like it would crush me. Linda Morrison kept working the case, trying to track Frank down. She hired a private investigator who eventually traced Frank to the Joplin condo I'd found evidence of. But by the time the investigator got there, Frank had cleared out. The property had been sold in April, just weeks after he'd left. Frank had taken the money, about $60,000 after paying off the mortgage on that place, and disappeared again. The investigator did find something useful, though, the woman from the photograph. Her name was Crystal Winters, and she was 34 years old, a real estate agent in Joplin. According to neighbors, she and Frank had been living together in that condo for at least 3 years, maybe longer. They'd posed as a married couple, had regular dinner parties, were active in the local community. When the investigator approached Crystal, she refused to talk, but her attorney sent a letter stating that Miss Winters had no knowledge of Mr. Henderson's marital status until recently and was not involved in any legal matters concerning his marriage. It was a lie, obviously. The property documents showed Frank had bought that condo in 1997, and neighbors said Crystal had moved in shortly after. She'd known the whole time. She'd been living with my husband while I was at home in Springfield clipping coupons and worrying about how to afford Jennifer's prom dress. The rage I felt when I learned this was physical, something I could taste in my mouth, something that made my hands shake and my vision blur. This woman had stolen years of my life, had been part of the deception that kept me trapped in a fake marriage while Frank drained our resources to fund his other life with her. And now she was hiding behind lawyers and claiming ignorance. But even with the investigators' findings, we still couldn't locate Frank. Crystal claimed she didn't know where he'd gone, said he'd left her too. Another lie, probably, but we couldn't prove otherwise. The Joplin condo had been sold to a third party. Frank's trail had gone cold. By the fall of 2001, I'd accepted that Frank might never be found, that I might never get child support or my share of the hidden assets he'd stolen from our marriage. I'd accepted that I was truly on my own, that whatever future I built would be built on my own strength and determination. Jennifer started her senior year working harder than any teenager should have to work. She was taking AP classes, working 20 hours a week, and still somehow finding time to fill out scholarship applications. She'd given up on expensive private schools and was focusing on Missouri State University right here in Springfield, where she could live at home and save money. Michael started freshman year at Central High quieter than he'd been, more withdrawn. He'd made friends with some boys I didn't approve of, kids who smoked behind the gym and had reputations for trouble. I was losing him, I could feel it, and I didn't know how to reach him when I was barely keeping my own head above water. At night, after the kids were asleep, I'd lie in bed and think about all those years with Frank. I'd replay conversations, moments, trying to figure out when exactly I'd lost him, when the man I'd married had become this stranger who could abandon his family without a second thought. Had he ever loved me? Had any of it been real? Or had our entire marriage been just a cover story, a convenient facade he maintained while living his real life somewhere else? I thought about Crystal Winters, too, probably more than I should have. I'd imagine confronting her, telling her exactly what she'd helped destroy. I'd imagine her feeling guilty, apologizing, explaining how Frank had manipulated her, too. But I knew that was fantasy. People who could do what she'd done didn't feel guilt or shame. They just moved on to their next victim, their next lie. Somewhere around Thanksgiving, a holiday we barely celebrated that year, just the 3 of us and a chicken instead of a turkey because we couldn't afford more, I realized something had changed in me. The woman who'd married Frank Henderson at 22, who'd spent 18 years trying to be the perfect wife, who'd accepted his explanations and swallowed her doubts and blamed herself for his anger, that woman was gone. In her place was someone harder, someone who'd learned that trust was a luxury I couldn't afford, that stability was an illusion, that the only person I could truly depend on was myself. I didn't like this new version of me entirely. She was more cynical, quicker to anger, slower to hope. But she was also stronger. She was surviving. And survival, I'd learned, was its own kind of victory. The divorce was granted in absentia in January of 2002, almost a year after Frank had left. The judge awarded me the house, what was left of it anyway, and granted full custody of both children, since Frank couldn't be located to contest it. The court also ordered Frank to pay child support and awarded me a portion of the marital assets, but those were just words on paper. Without Frank, there was no way to enforce any of it. Linda didn't charge me her full fee. She knew I couldn't afford it, and she'd believed in my case enough to work mostly pro bono. I paid her what I could, grateful for her kindness, even as I understood it was charity, that I'd become one of those women who needed help from generous lawyers because they couldn't afford justice on their own. Life settled into a new normal. Work, bills, kids, repeat. Jennifer graduated high school in the spring of 2002 and started at Missouri State that fall on a combination of scholarships, grants, and student loans. Michael made it through his sophomore year without getting expelled or arrested, which felt like a victory given how angry and lost he'd become. I dated a little, though calling it dating was probably generous. A few dinners with nice enough men who couldn't understand why I was so guarded, so unwilling to trust. They'd eventually move on to easier women without baggage, and I'd tell myself I was fine with it. Romance wasn't a priority. Survival was. Years passed. The house gradually fell into more disrepair. I fixed what I absolutely had to and let the rest go. The kids grew up, moved forward with their lives despite the rocky start we'd given them. Jennifer graduated college and got a job as a teacher. Michael joined the Army after high school, said he needed structure and discipline, needed to get away from Springfield and all its memories. I kept working at Precision Parts, moving from receptionist to administrative assistant to office manager over the years. My salary increased slowly but steadily. I was never going to be wealthy, but I managed. I survived. I built a small, quiet life that belonged to me and me alone. And I never heard from Frank Henderson again. Not a word, not a letter, not even a rumor of where he'd gone or what he was doing. He'd vanished completely. Like he'd never existed at all, except for the 2 children he'd left behind and the wreckage of a woman who'd once believed in forever. I told myself I'd moved on. I told myself I didn't think about him anymore, didn't wonder if he ever felt guilty, didn't imagine what I'd say if I ever saw him again. I told myself I'd forgiven him, not for his sake, but for mine, because carrying rage for 20 years would only poison my own life. I told myself a lot of things. Some of them were even true. But I never forgot. I never stopped being angry, somewhere deep down in a place I didn't like to acknowledge. And I never stopped wondering if someday, somehow, there would be justice for what he'd done. I just didn't know it would take 20 years for that day to come. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in September of 2021, 20 years and 7 months after Frank had walked out of our lives. I was 62 years old by then. Still working at Precision Parts, though I was planning to retire in a few years when I turned 65 and could collect full Social Security. I was living alone in the same house on the west side of Springfield, the house that had slowly become more mine than ours over the decades, its imperfections a testament to survival rather than failure. I'd just poured my second cup of coffee when my cell phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Missouri area code, but not Springfield. I almost didn't answer. Telemarketing calls were constant these days, but something made me pick up. "Is this Dorothy Henderson?" a woman's voice asked, professional and careful. "It's Dorothy Wilson now," I said, though technically I'd never changed my name back. The divorce decree had returned me to my maiden name, but I'd never bothered with all the paperwork. Driver's license, social security card, bank accounts. It seemed like too much effort for a name that didn't matter much anyway. Who's calling? Miss Wilson? My name is Patricia Brennan. I'm an attorney with Brennan and Associates in Joplin. I'm calling regarding the estate of Frank Robert Henderson. I understand you were previously married to Mr. Henderson? The coffee cup in my hand stopped halfway to my mouth. Frank. After 20 years of silence, his name coming through my phone like a ghost made flesh. I was married to him, yes, I said slowly, a long time ago. Why are you calling me about his estate? Mr. Henderson passed away 6 weeks ago, Miss Wilson. I'm the executor of his will, and you're named as a beneficiary. I need to discuss some matters with you regarding the distribution of his assets. I set the coffee cup down carefully on the counter, afraid I'd drop it otherwise. Frank was dead. Dead. After 2 decades of wondering where he was, what he was doing, if he ever thought about the family he'd abandoned, he was just gone, permanently. How did he die? I asked, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, distant and calm. Heart attack, Patricia Brennan said, very sudden according to the medical examiner. He was 71 years old. 71? Frank would have turned 71 in June. I'd stopped keeping track of his birthday years ago, but apparently some part of my brain had held on to that information anyway. You said I'm a beneficiary, I asked, because I needed to focus on something concrete, something that made sense. That seems unlikely. He left me with nothing 20 years ago. I understand this must be confusing, Patricia said. Could you possibly come to my office in Joplin? There are documents you need to see, things I need to explain in person. Would this Friday work for you? I should have said no, should have told her to mail me whatever papers needed signing and left it at that. But curiosity, and maybe something darker? Something that wanted to see what crumbs Frank had deigned to leave me after stealing years of my life, made me agree. Friday afternoon, I drove the 2 hours from Springfield to Joplin, a route I'd never taken before despite living in Missouri my whole life. The drive gave me too much time to think, to wonder, to feel things I thought I'd buried decades ago. Patricia Brennan's office was in a modern building downtown, all glass and chrome. She was younger than I expected, maybe in her mid-40s, with kind eyes and a firm handshake. She led me to a conference room and asked if I wanted coffee or water. I said water, my throat suddenly dry. Before we begin, Patricia said, sitting across from me with a thick folder in front of her, I want you to know that I didn't know your ex-husband personally. I was retained by him about 5 years ago to handle his estate planning. What I'm about to tell you may be difficult to hear. I've survived difficult before, I said, and I meant it. She opened the folder and slid a photograph across the table. It was Frank, but older, his hair completely gray, his face lined and weathered. He was sitting in what looked like a nursing home room, wearing a cardigan and holding a book. He looked diminished somehow, smaller than I remembered. Mr. Henderson spent the last 3 years of his life in Sunset Gardens Memory Care Facility here in Joplin, Patricia said. He was diagnosed with early-onset dementia in 2016, and it progressed rapidly. By 2018, he required full-time care. I stared at the photograph, trying to reconcile this frail old man with the vital, scheming person who destroyed my life. Frank had dementia. Frank had died in a nursing home, probably confused and frightened, his mind betraying him the way he'd betrayed so many others. I didn't feel satisfaction at that thought. I didn't feel much of anything except a distant, detached observation of irony. The reason I asked you here, Patricia continued, is because Mr. Henderson's will contains some unusual provisions, and his estate is considerably more complex than typical cases I handle. She pulled out more documents, bank statements and property records and investment portfolios. The numbers I saw made my breath catch. Mr. Henderson's total estate is valued at approximately $2.3 million, Patricia said, watching my face carefully. This includes the proceeds from several properties he owned and sold over the years, investments he made in the early 2000s that appreciated significantly, and a life insurance policy with a substantial cash value. $2.3 million. The number was so absurd I almost laughed. Frank, who'd left me scrambling to pay an $847 mortgage, who'd forced his daughter to work through her senior year and his son to quit basketball, who'd made us rely on food stamps and charity, he'd been worth millions. His will divides his estate into 4 parts, Patricia continued. 25% goes to his son, Michael Henderson. 25% goes to his daughter, Jennifer Henderson. 25% goes to you, Dorothy Henderson, with a provision that if you'd remarried or predeceased him, your portion would be divided between the children. I couldn't speak, couldn't process what I was hearing. Frank had left me money, a quarter of his estate, over $500,000 probably if my shocked brain was doing the math correctly. The final 25%, Patricia said, and her voice took on a different tone, is designated for the care of Crystal Winters. That name, after 20 years, hearing it still made something twist in my chest. Crystal is alive? I asked. Patricia's expression grew sad. Yes, but she's also in memory care. Same facility where Mr. Henderson was actually, though in a different wing. She was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's about 8 years ago. She's only 62, but the disease has progressed significantly. She no longer recognizes visitors or communicates verbally. 62, the same age I was. Crystal Winters, the woman who'd stolen my husband, was my age and trapped in her own failing mind, unable to enjoy whatever life she'd built on the ruins of mine. Mr. Henderson set up a trust for her care, Patricia explained. The money from his portion of the estate goes directly to Sunset Gardens to pay her expenses for as long as she lives. When she passes, anything remaining will be distributed to a dementia research charity. I sat back in my chair, overwhelmed by information I couldn't begin to process. Frank was dead. He'd been sick for years, his mind gradually erasing him. Crystal was sick too, lost in fog. And somehow, after everything, Frank had left me money, left our children money. Why? I asked finally. Why would he leave me anything? He abandoned us. He stole from us. He disappeared for 20 years without a word. Patricia was quiet for a moment, then pulled out one more document. He left you a letter. I'm required by the terms of the will to give it to you when we met. You don't have to read it now or ever, but it's yours. She slid an envelope across the table. My name was written on it in handwriting that was shakier than I remembered, but still recognizably Frank's. I stared at it like it might bite me. There's more you need to know, Patricia said gently. Mr. Henderson wasn't always wealthy. According to his financial records, he came into substantial money in 2003, 2 years after he left you. His father, I believe that would be his stepfather actually, died and left him nearly $800,000. Mr. Henderson invested it wisely, and it grew considerably over the years. 2 years after he'd abandoned us, 2 years after I'd been working myself to exhaustion and watching my children sacrifice their futures because we had nothing, Frank had inherited money that could have changed everything, and he'd kept it for himself. The rage that flooded through me then was clean and pure and 20 years in the making. He knew, I said, my voice shaking. He knew we were struggling. He could have helped at any time. He could have paid child support, could have contributed to Jennifer's education, could have given Michael opportunities he had to go without. He had money and he chose to let us suffer. I don't know Mr. Henderson's reasoning, Patricia said carefully. I only know what's in his will and the instructions he left. But, Miss Wilson, there's one more thing. The letter explains some of it, but I think you should know that Mr. Henderson tried to contact you several times over the years. I looked up sharply. What? According to my notes from conversations with him before his dementia became severe, he said he'd sent letters to your Springfield address in 2005 and 2008. He claimed he tried to call the house in 2010, but the number had been disconnected. He said he wanted to reconnect with his children, but didn't know how to reach them. I never received any letters, I said firmly, and our number wasn't disconnected in 2010. I had the same landline until 2015. Patricia nodded slowly. It's possible the letters were lost or sent to an incorrect address, or, she hesitated, it's possible Mr. Henderson's memory of these events wasn't accurate even before his diagnosis. Dementia can begin affecting memory years before it's formally diagnosed. So I'd never know, would never know if Frank had actually tried to reach out, if those attempts had somehow failed, or if his diseased brain had created memories of reconciliation that never happened. It didn't matter, I realized. Nothing he'd done or not done in those 20 years could change what he'd done in 2001. I took the envelope with Frank's letter and stood up. When can I expect the distribution of the estate? Once probate is complete, which should be within 6 months. I'll keep you informed of the progress. Miss Wilson, I know this is a lot to process. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact me. I drove home in a daze, the letter sitting on the passenger seat untouched. I didn't open it that night, or the next day, or even the next week. I told Jennifer and Michael about Frank's death, about the inheritance that was coming. Jennifer cried, surprising me. She'd barely mentioned her father in years. Michael was quiet, his expression unreadable, and then he said, "Good," which was the most emotion he'd shown about his father in 2 decades. The letter sat in my kitchen drawer for 3 weeks, a small white envelope that seemed to radiate accusation and explanation in equal measure. Finally, on a quiet Sunday morning in October, I made myself a cup of tea, sat down at my kitchen table, and opened it. The handwriting was messy, deteriorating, probably written during the early stages of his dementia, but the words were clear enough. Dorothy, if you're reading this, I'm dead and you've met with Patricia about the will. I know you probably hate me. You have every right to. I've spent the last few years trying to remember exactly why I did what I did, and the truth is, I can't, not clearly. My memory isn't what it was, and sometimes I can't tell what's real and what isn't anymore. What I do know is this. I was a coward. I was selfish. I built a life with you while maintaining another life with Crystal, and when it became too complicated to maintain both, I chose the easier path. I chose to run rather than face what I'd done. I chose to pretend you and the kids didn't exist rather than deal with the guilt of betraying you. The money from my stepfather came in 2003. I should have sent it to you. I should have made sure Jennifer and Michael had what they needed, but I didn't because I was still running, still hiding, still being the same coward who'd walked away in the first place. By the time I had enough courage to try to fix things, you'd moved on. The letters I sent came back. The number I had was disconnected, and I told myself it was too late, that you'd built a life without me, and I should leave you alone. Crystal got sick about 8 years ago. Watching her fade has been the hardest thing I've ever experienced. She doesn't know me anymore. She doesn't remember our life together, the good parts or the bad parts. Sometimes I see her looking at me like I'm a stranger, and I realize that's what I made you feel like, married to a stranger who was living a double life you knew nothing about. I'm sick too now. The doctors say it's dementia, that it'll get worse. I'm forgetting things already. I forget whole years sometimes, Wake up thinking it's 1985 or 1992 and get confused when things don't match my memories. But I haven't forgotten you, Dorothy. I haven't forgotten the way you looked at me when I told you I was leaving, like I'd ripped your heart out. I haven't forgotten that I destroyed our family because I was too weak to be honest. The money I'm leaving you and the kids can't fix what I broke. I know that. But it's all I have left to give. I hope it helps. I hope you've built a good life despite what I did. I hope Jennifer and Michael turned out okay. I hope someday you can forgive me, not for my sake, but for yours, so you don't have to carry the anger anymore. I'm sorry, Dorothy, for all of it, for every lie, every betrayal, every moment of pain I caused you. I'm sorry I wasn't the man you deserved. I'm sorry I wasn't the father our children deserved. I'm sorry it took me dying to finally do the right thing. Frank. I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. Then I went to my bedroom, lay down on my bed, and cried for the first time in years. Not for Frank exactly, but for the waste of it all, for the years we'd all lost. For the man he could have been if he'd had even a fraction of the courage he claimed to lack. For the woman I'd been at 22 who'd believed in forever, who trusted completely, who'd never imagined her husband could be capable of such sustained deception. I cried for Jennifer, who'd worked her way through college when she shouldn't have had to, who'd chosen schools based on cost rather than dreams. I cried for Michael, who'd joined the army to escape the poverty his father could have prevented, who'd seen combat in Iraq and come home with nightmares because he'd needed structure and purpose his broken family couldn't provide. I cried for myself, for 42-year-old Dorothy, who'd been left with nothing, who'd fought so hard just to survive, who'd sacrificed pieces of herself year after year to keep her children fed and housed and safe. And when I was done crying, when there were no tears left, I felt something I hadn't felt in 20 years. Closure. Not forgiveness. Exactly. I wasn't sure I'd ever truly forgive Frank for what he'd done, but a kind of peace, an acceptance that it was over now. He was gone. The questions I'd carried for 2 decades would never be fully answered, but they also no longer mattered as much as they once had. Frank was dead, and I was alive, still standing, still fighting, still here. That was its own kind of victory. The inheritance cleared probate in March of 2022, just as Patricia had predicted. The final amounts, after taxes and fees, came to $547,000 for me, and the same for each of the kids. It was more money than I'd ever imagined having, money that arrived in my bank account like a miracle I still didn't quite believe was real. Jennifer, who was 38 by then and teaching high school English in Kansas City, used her inheritance to buy a house and set up college funds for her 2 daughters. She'd married a good man named David, a fellow teacher who loved her fiercely and treated her like gold. She'd built a life completely different from the unstable, poverty-marked childhood she'd endured, and seeing her happy made something in my chest loosen and warm. Michael, 40 years old and living in Colorado after leaving the Army, used part of his inheritance to finally go to college, something he'd always wanted but never thought he could afford. He was studying environmental science at the University of Colorado, planning to work for the Park Service. He'd also used some of the money for therapy, dealing with the PTSD from his deployments and the childhood trauma from Frank's abandonment. He called me more often now, his voice lighter than it had been in years. As for me, I retired from Precision Parts immediately. 20 years of answering phones and managing schedules was enough. I was done. I paid off the house completely, erasing the mortgage that had haunted me for decades. I fixed everything that had broken over the years, the air conditioning, the dishwasher, the roof that had been leaking into the attic. I painted every room in colors I actually liked, not just whatever was cheapest at the hardware store. I set aside enough in safe investments to ensure I'd have steady income for the rest of my life, more than my Social Security would have provided. And then I did something I'd been dreaming about since I was a little girl reading library books in Springfield. I traveled. I went to places I'd only read about in those books. New York City, where I saw a Broadway show and walked through Central Park. Washington, D.C., where I spent 3 days in the Smithsonian museums, just soaking in history and art and culture. I took a train across the country to Seattle, watching America roll past my window. I even flew to London for a week, my first time ever leaving the country, and wandered through the British Museum feeling like I'd stepped into another world. I wasn't trying to make up for lost time exactly. You can't reclaim years that are gone. But I was living, really living, for the first time since I was that young woman who'd married Frank Henderson and thought she knew what her future would hold. The news about Crystal Winters came about 8 months after the inheritance cleared. Patricia Brennan called to let me know Crystal had passed away peacefully in her sleep at Sunset Gardens. The remaining funds from Frank's portion of the estate, about $340,000, would be going to the dementia research charity as stipulated in his will. I felt nothing when I heard Crystal was dead. Not satisfaction, not grief, not even the closure I'd felt when I learned about Frank. She was just gone, another ghost from a painful past that no longer had power over my present. I did something unexpected with part of my inheritance. I donated $50,000 to a local organization that helped women leaving abusive or financially controlling relationships. It wasn't enough to change the world, but it helped provide legal services, emergency housing, and job training for women who were where I'd been, trapped, scared, trying to build something from nothing. The director of the organization, a woman named Rachel who'd survived her own nightmare marriage, told me the donation would help over 100 women that year. 100 women who wouldn't have to face what I faced alone, who'd have resources and support and people fighting for them. That felt like something. That felt like taking the poison Frank had left in my life and transmuting it into something good, something healing. I also reconnected with old friends I'd lost touch with over the years. Carol and I had always stayed close, but there were other women from church, from the old neighborhood, from jobs I'd worked, women I'd pulled away from out of shame or exhaustion or just the grinding dailiness of survival. I reached out, apologized for my absence, and, to my surprise, most of them welcomed me back without hesitation. We formed a group, 6 women ranging from late 50s to early 70s, all of us with stories of hardship and survival, all of us determined to enjoy whatever years we had left. We called ourselves the Still Standing Club, which started as a joke but became something real and meaningful. We met for lunch every other Thursday, took day trips to places around Missouri, supported each other through health scares and family dramas, and the simple difficulties of aging in America. These women became my tribe, my chosen family. They knew my story, all of it, and they didn't judge or pity me. They just understood, because most of them had their own versions of it, their own Franks and Crystals and years of struggle. Together, we were stronger than any of us had been alone. I also started seeing someone, which shocked everyone who knew me, including myself. His name was Robert, a widower I met at the library of all places. We were both reaching for the same book, a mystery novel by Nevada Barr, and we got to talking about favorite authors and books we'd read. He asked if I'd like to get coffee sometime, and something in his gentle demeanor, his kind eyes, made me say yes. Robert was 68, a retired teacher who'd lost his wife to cancer 5 years earlier. He had grown children who lived out of state, a small house in the Roundtree neighborhood, the same area where Frank and I had lived when we first married, and a gentle way about him that never made me feel rushed or pressured. We took things slow. Coffee dates turned into dinner dates, which turned into day trips and long conversations about books and politics and what we wanted from whatever time we had left. He knew about Frank, about the abandonment and the years of struggle, and he never tried to fix it or minimize it. He just listened, and then he shared his own story of loss and learning to live again. I wasn't sure I'd ever remarry. Wasn't sure I wanted to tie my life to another person after what happened with Frank. But being with Robert was easy in a way I'd never experienced before. There were no secrets, no hidden accounts, no wondering where he was or who he was with. He was exactly who he appeared to be, a good man who'd lived through pain and come out the other side still capable of kindness. One evening, about a year after we'd started seeing each other, Robert and I were sitting on my newly repaired front porch watching the sunset paint the Missouri sky in shades of orange and pink. He reached over and took my hand, his grip warm and steady. "I'm not him," he said quietly, and I knew exactly who he meant. "I can't promise I won't die and leave you. I'm 69 years old. That's the reality of our age. But I can promise I'll never lie to you. I'll never hide who I am or what I'm doing. What you see is what you get, Dorothy." Just an old man who thinks you're remarkable and wants to spend whatever time we have left being happy together. I squeezed his hand and felt tears prick my eyes, the good kind this time. "That's all I need," I told him. "Honesty, presence, someone who shows up and means what they say." "I can do that," he said, and he smiled at me like I was something precious. We didn't get married. Neither of us saw the point at our age, with our finances already settled and our lives already established. But we became partners, companions, whatever label fit two people who'd found each other in the autumn of their lives and decided to face the winter together. My 64th birthday came in June of 2023, and my children came to Springfield to celebrate with me. Jennifer brought her family, David and the two girls, Emma and Sophie, who were growing up so fast it made my heart ache. Michael drove in from Colorado with his girlfriend, a kind woman named Teresa, who worked for the National Park Service. We had a barbecue in my backyard, which Robert had helped me landscape into something beautiful, flower beds and a small vegetable garden, and a patio where we could sit in the evenings. The kids played while the adults talked and laughed, and at some point I looked around at these people I loved, this family that had survived and even thrived despite Frank's best efforts to destroy us, and I felt something I hadn't felt in decades. Pride. Not the kind that comes from accomplishments or achievements, but the deeper kind that comes from endurance, from surviving what should have broken you and coming out whole on the other side. Jennifer found me in the kitchen later, helping clean up the dinner plates. She hugged me from behind, resting her chin on my shoulder the way she used to when she was little. "You did good, Mom," she said softly. "Despite everything Dad put us through, you kept us together. You kept us safe. You taught us we could survive anything. You kids did that yourselves." I told her, turning to face her. "You and Michael, you're strong because you chose to be, not because I made you." "We're strong because you showed us how," she insisted. "You never gave up. Even when it would have been easier to fall apart, you kept going. That's what I remember most from those years, not the poverty or the struggle, but you waking up every morning and fighting for us." I hugged my daughter tight, this woman who'd been forced to grow up too fast, but had somehow turned into someone wise and kind and unbroken. "I love you," I whispered. "I'm so proud of who you've become." "I love you too, Mom," she said. "And I'm proud of who you've become too. You're not just surviving anymore. You're living. Finally living." She was right. For the first time since I was 22 years old and full of naive hope about the future, I was genuinely happy. Not just content or managing or getting by, but actually happy. I had a home I loved, children who'd turned out wonderfully despite their rocky start, grandchildren who filled my life with joy, a partner who treated me with respect and affection, friends who made me laugh, and financial security I'd never thought I'd have. Frank's money had helped, no question, but the real victory wasn't the inheritance. It was the fact that I'd survived the 20 years without it. I'd kept my children fed and housed and loved through the hardest times imaginable. I'd worked jobs that exhausted me and sacrificed things I wanted and made impossible choices, and I'd done it all without his help or support. The money just made the life I'd already built a little easier, a little more comfortable. It didn't define my worth or my strength. That had been there all along, forged in the fires of abandonment and single motherhood and poverty, tempered by years of refusing to give up. I'd won, not because Frank had died and left me money, but because I'd lived. I'd kept living when it would have been easier to give up, kept fighting when the odds seemed impossible, kept hoping when hope felt foolish. And now, at 64 years old, I was reaping the rewards of my own resilience. Not his generosity, but my own refusal to be defeated. That felt like justice, not the kind that comes from courts or revenge, but the deeper kind that comes from surviving your worst day and building something beautiful from the wreckage. Orchestrated final narrative section with engagement elements and supplementary deliverables. Now I need to write the final section, Section 9, Motivational Closing, 1,000 to 1,300 words. This should include reflection on personal journey, specific lessons learned, inspirational message for other women, it's never too late to action relevant to the story, strong final call to action, affectionate farewell. I also need to include the third mandatory engagement reminder before the final inspirational message. Let me make sure it's unique and connected to this specific story. After the story, I need to provide total word count, create 5 thumbnail phrases, max 25 words each, ask if they want the description. If yes, create SEO YouTube description, max 400 words. Now, sitting here in my living room on a quiet afternoon, I think about that moment 2 years ago when I stood in Patricia Brennan's office learning about Frank's death and the inheritance. I think about the journey that brought me there, from a young bride full of hope to a desperate single mother fighting for survival, to a woman in her 60s finally living the life she deserved. People sometimes ask me if I forgive Frank. It's a complicated question with an answer that's evolved over time. Do I forgive him for leaving, for stealing from us, for letting us struggle while he had money that could have changed our lives? I honestly don't know. Some days I think I do. Some days I'm still angry at the waste of it all, the unnecessary pain he inflicted on people who loved him. But what I've learned is that forgiveness is less about him and more about me. It's about not letting his choices continue to poison my life decades later. It's about understanding that carrying rage for 20 years only hurts the person carrying it. Frank is gone now, beyond a reach of my anger or my forgiveness. What matters is that I'm still here, still standing, still capable of joy and love and hope. The lessons I learned through those difficult years have shaped everything about who I am today. I learned that strength isn't about never falling. It's about getting up every single time you do. I learned that survival is active, not passive. You have to fight for it, work for it, choose it every morning when you wake up. I learned that shame is a luxury you can't afford when you're trying to keep your children fed and safe. There's no room for pride when you're applying for food stamps or accepting charity from your church. You do what you have to do, and you hold your head high while doing it. I learned that community matters. The people who helped me during those lean years, my sister Carol, the anonymous donors who left groceries on my porch, Dr. Patterson, who paid me fairly and with respect, the women who eventually became my Still Standing Club, they saved me as much as my own determination did. Nobody survives alone. We all need people who believe in us when we can't believe in ourselves. I learned that children are more resilient than we give them credit for, but they're also more damaged than they let on. Jennifer and Michael survived our years of poverty, but they carry scars from it. The difference is they've learned to transform those scars into strength, to use their painful experiences to build lives intentionally different from what they grew up with. That's not despite the hardship, it's because of it. Most importantly, I learned that it's never too late to reclaim your life. At 42, when Frank left, I thought my life was over. I thought I'd spend the rest of my years just surviving, just getting by, never really living. I was wrong. Some of my happiest years have been these last few, past 60, when I finally had the freedom and resources to become who I was always meant to be. If you're listening to this story and you're struggling, whether it's a bad marriage, financial hardship, betrayal, loss, or just the grinding difficulty of making it through each day, I want you to hear this. You are stronger than you know. The fact that you're still here, still trying, still hoping, proves that. Your story isn't over. The chapter you're in might be painful, but it's not the final chapter. It's never too late to start over. It's never too late to leave a situation that's destroying you. It's never too late to go back to school, change careers, move to a new city, fall in love again, make new friends, discover new passions. Age is just a number, and the calendar doesn't get to decide when your life becomes worth living. I was 42 when I had to rebuild from nothing. I was 62 when inheritance finally gave me financial security. I was 63 when I met Robert and discovered I could still open my heart to someone new. Every age brought its own challenges and gifts. Every year taught me something I needed to know. To the women especially, and I know most of you listening are women, probably women who faced your own versions of what I went through, please hear this. Your worth is not determined by whether someone chooses to stay or leave. Your value doesn't depend on a man's opinion of you or treatment of you. You are complete and whole exactly as you are, and anyone who makes you feel otherwise is wrong. If you're in a relationship where you feel controlled, manipulated, or deliberately kept in the dark about finances or important decisions, trust that instinct. You're not paranoid. You're not overreacting. You deserve honesty, respect, and partnership. Don't spend years ignoring red flags like I did. Don't wait for things to get so bad that the choice is made for you. And if you're already on the other side of betrayal or abandonment, already in the struggle of rebuilding, know that what you're doing matters. Every small step forward counts. Every bill you pay, every meal you put on the table, every time you show up for your children, even when you're exhausted and scared and don't know how you'll make it, that's heroic. That's strength of a magnitude that people who've never had to do it can't comprehend. You know, making it through to the end of this story means something. You've spent time with me, heard my journey, hopefully felt less alone in your own struggles. If this story touched you, if it resonated with you, I'd love it if you'd hit that like button. And please share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what country you're watching from. Tell me if you faced similar challenges. Tell me what gave you strength to keep going. Your story matters too, and sometimes just writing it out helps you process what you've been through. The like and your comments help this channel reach more women who need to hear these stories, who need to know they're not alone. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more real stories of women who've survived, thrived, and refused to be defeated by life's hardest moments. Together, we're building a community of strong, resilient women supporting each other. I'm 64 years old now. I've got more life behind me than ahead of me, probably. But these years, these hard-won, dearly bought, beautifully lived years, are mine. They belong to me in a way my younger years never did, when I was defining myself by someone else's expectations, someone else's lies. I wake up every morning in a house that's truly mine, next to a man who truly sees me, surrounded by evidence of a life I built from ashes. I have grandchildren who call me on the phone just to tell me about their day. I have children who turned out to be magnificent adults despite the rocky start I gave them. I have friends who make me laugh until I cry, and adventures still ahead of me, and dreams I'm still chasing. Frank thought he destroyed me when he left. Maybe he thought he was doing me a favor, freeing me from a marriage that was built on lies. Maybe he thought I'd remarry quickly, find someone else to take care of me, never know what he'd stolen. Or maybe he didn't think about me at all, too consumed with his own desires and his own life to care about the wreckage he left behind. It doesn't matter what he thought, because he was wrong. He didn't destroy me. He tested me, challenged me, forced me to discover strength I never knew I had. And while I wouldn't choose to go through those years again, I also wouldn't trade who I became because of them. I survived Frank Henderson. More than that, I thrived despite him. And if I can do it, a working-class woman from Missouri with no college degree and no safety net, then so can you. Whatever you're facing, whatever mountain looks too steep to climb, you have what it takes. You're already doing it just by getting through each day. So thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for letting me into your life for this little while. I hope it helped. I hope it gave you strength or hope or just the comfort of knowing someone else understands what it's like to have your world fall apart and have to piece it back together with shaking hands and stubborn determination. Remember, it's never too late to reclaim your life. It's never too late to become who you were meant to be. And you're never too old, too broke, too damaged, or too anything to deserve happiness and peace and a life you love. Keep going, keep fighting, keep believing in yourself, even when it feels impossible. The best chapters of your story might still be ahead of you, just waiting for you to turn the page. This is Dorothy Wilson, and this is my real story. Thank you for being here with me.